Hello y'all, I'm Becky Johnson with Sweetheart Quilt Design Company, and we are here today with the fifth in our series, the fifth of 8 in our binding series. And what we're going to do today is a method of completely machine sewing on your binding. And I like to teach this because there's a few different reasons why you might want to machine sew on your binding. Some people's hands have arthritis, or it's just difficult for them to hand sew the back of their quilt. Sometimes people want to do it a little faster. For me, this quilt and that quilt are both going to be donated to the NICU at the local hospital, and so I like to have machine stitch the binding so it's more secure for them. And so what we're going to do today, I'm going to show you how to do this binding so that it has this little decorative trim in there. I like the look of that. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, I've got my quilt trimmed with my 1/8 inch extra, and my binding is made, and I've made that blue stuff over there is going to be our trim color. So what I'm going to do this time is we're going to sew the binding to the back of the quilt. And we're going to line it up. We're going to start in the middle so that we have room to do that final diagonal seam at the end. And we're going to line this up. We're going to start in the middle, and we're going to come in that 1/8 of an inch because we trimmed with the extra 1/8 of an inch on the outside. So I'll just put a binding clip in there, and that'll let us know where we're going to start. Now, when we get down to the corner, we're going to put a couple more clips in here just so it stays in place for us. Now, I have an ability to eyeball an 1/8 of an inch. If that's not one of your natural talents, you can use a ruler and you can just measure it so that it's an 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to stop. I'm going to put in a pin here. Make sure it's straight. I'm going to put a pin in right here, so I'm basically 3/8 of an inch in. And that's where I want to stop sewing. So I'm going to stop here with my needle down. Then I'll be stitching this way. I'm going to turn the quilt this way, so that I'm ready to stitch down the side. But the first thing I'm going to do is back up about 3 or 4 stitches so that my needle is in the back of the quilt but off the binding. And then we're going to put in a pin, and I'll take this pin out when I'm doing it, but we want to put the pin in, and it's an 1/8 of an inch in because that's where the edge of our quilt top is. And we're going to back this out. We won't be able to completely do it, but I'm going to take this up to the top here, and it's not laying because that pin is in there. It's not laying quite right, but that's pretty close. And so that I'm going to take that pin up to the edge of the binding where we were sewing it in, and you can see under here there's a nice 45-degree angle, and then from there I can just start stitching again at my 1/8 inch in. So that's what we're going to do when we get to the corner. I guess I could have left that pin in. Okay, so I've got my pin in, so I know where to stop. And we're going to start stitching. When I start, I like to do a quick back stitch, and then I like to work with my needle down. And I'm stitching this on with a 1/4 inch seam. And you do want to work with a walking foot because you have lots of layers of fabric. 4 layers of fabric and the batting. So now I'm down to here, and I'm going to stitch till my pin tells me to stop. Go in there carefully so I don't hit it. Then I'm rotating so that I'm going like this. Sorry, I've got the binding. So I'm going like this, and then I'm going to back up. Yeah. So I'm just off the edge. I'm going to take my pin and put it in here 1/8 of an inch in. Oops, caught the backing fabric. You have to just go through the binding. I'm going to lift my presser foot and fold it right where that pin is and pull that pin so it's up here even with the edge of my binding. And then I've got my fabric laid out so it goes 1/8 of an inch at 1/8 of an inch, and I can start stitching again. And then I'll just work my way around the quilt. The nice thing about doing this online is you can watch that corner over and over again. All right, and then I'll just make my way around the quilt. And when I get to this side where I started, I'm going to stop stitching about 8 inches away from where I started and just do a quick back stitch. And then we'll talk about how to put a diagonal seam in here so we're still spreading out the seam allowance. Okay, so I've sewn all the binding on all the way around the quilt, and I stopped about 8 inches from where I started. So I have my little tail. Oh, I think I forgot to tell you that. Leave a tail when you start. And I'm going to trim this just a little past halfway on this spot. And I just take my scissors, and sometimes I get it straight and sometimes I don't, but it can always be retrimmed. That time I think I did all right. And then we want these two pieces to overlap by the width of the binding. So I used to do it with a ruler and it was completely awkward. And I've figured out that if I just do it with the tail of the binding, or if you don't have enough left to do it with the tail, you might have a binding piece left over, and that works much more easily. So what I'm going to do is then lap this over the binding, and I'm going to trim it at the edge here. I actually like to come in about 1/16 of an inch from the edge, but basically trimming it at the edge here. All right. And then I'm going to take these two pieces and lift them up so they're flat. Then you kind of have to scooch the quilt together, but you just need to take one of those ends and turn it 90 degrees. And then we're going to go ahead and pin. When we put our binding together, we had those selvage edges sticking out to show us where the corners were, but on this we don't. So I'm putting this together, and I'm just going to put a pin in, and then I'm going to look. No, I didn't quite get it in at the right spot, so I'm going to scoot it over. Yeah, that's pointing to the corner now. So then I know that where my pin is pointing, that's where I'm going to start stitching, and I'm going to stitch it straight through. Little bit awkward. That's why you don't want to make this, you want to leave that 8 inches. You don't want to make it too tight, because the shorter your span is, the more awkward it is to sew this. All right, yep, that looks good. So before you trim it off, you want to stretch it out like this and make sure you didn't put a twist in it or get it, you know, make sure it's going to fit like that. And then I just take my, sorry, something's buzzing. I can't figure out what it is. I just take that and trim off that little corner, and then I can lay this flat and go back to sewing this. And I want to stick my finger under here and make sure my seam allowances are going the same direction. Now, when you're doing that, if you find you have just a little bit extra, it's okay to push it or stitch across it. And this is black, so I don't know if you can see it, but I have a little teeny weeny tuck. But it's only on this side, so by the time I wrap it around, it's not going to show. And that takes care of that fullness. Sometimes that happens. All right, now we're going to start working on putting in our trim piece. So with this trim, what I did is I cut 7/8 inch wide strips, and then I pressed them in half with the iron. And just press these, you have to avoid the steam. So if you have a steam button, you can shut that off or not trigger it, or just keep your hands out of the way. And you just want to press this in half. So I'm going to take my selvage edge off here. And then I'm going to pull this around to the front, and I'm going to lay this up here. I'm not going to start stitching in the corner because I need to, when I come the rest of the way around, I need to bring that into the corner. So what I'm going to do is get this set up and then put binder clips on it. So this little piece here goes that 1/8 of an inch in. So more or less at the edge of your quilt top, unless that wasn't quite straight. These little binder clips are real handy. They're flat on the bottom, and then you can slide them under and then just use your thumb to open them up and grab on. So I'm gonna leave that much for when I come back around, and I'm gonna leave just a little bigger gap in there so I can get my presser foot in there and I can start stitching. Now I find that if I put these binding clips on, I stitch this straighter. I'm happier with the end result. So it's worth the time to do it. And you can go as far as you have binding clips, and then once you stitch to the last one, leave the last one in place, and you can start putting more on while you're stitching just in front of your machine. You have to get these little threads out of the way. Oops. Oh, I forgot to explain. You cut these 7/8 inch strips, and then you sew them together. I have this one, this quilt for the NICU. It's so small that I can use one one width of the fabric for the top and the bottom, but then on the sides they're longer, so I went ahead and sewed those together with a diagonal seam, just like you do on binding, and then pressed them to one side and pressed them flat, or yeah, like that. Now, and you can look at this and say, well, that's a little wavy how she's putting it in, but as I stitch it, I'll pull it over just a little bit more, and because the clips are in there, I'm able to do that. Now, here I came to a seam in my binding, so I've got to be a little extra careful with that, just because it's just a touch thicker. I'm going to put in this one and then go back and pull that one over just a little bit. All right, I'm out of binding clips, so I'm going to go ahead and start sewing. You want your thread to match your binding, and we'll be stitching just right here, about a 1/16 of an inch in from the edge on that binding. Got stuck. So watch it as you stitch. Make sure you're keeping the trim as even as you can, the amount of trim that's showing as even and consistent as you can. Okay, now I'm going to stop there because I ran out of binding clips. And I'm going to set these up. It's a little bit of work to do this, but it gives you a lot better results, and it's much faster than hand stitching a binding. I like that decorative trim so much that I've started doing most of my bindings this way now. All right, time for more clips. Now, when you get down to the end like this, let me swivel it so you can see. When you get down to the end, and you might, if I'm doing a quilt that's not small enough for just these single strips, I just have it all sewn in, the trim sewn in one piece. So you just get down here and trim it off about at the edge of the quilt. And then you can keep on using the same strip. And I'm gonna, on this one, since I had them separate, I'm gonna trim off that selvage edge. And then I'm gonna go ahead and lay this in here. Lots of threads today. I'm gonna go ahead and lay this, put in a couple more clips, get rid of this one. Now, the easiest thing to do would be to put this one and then wrap the other one back, but that doesn't work because that would stack the folding over on our binding and make it thick on one side with 2 layers of the folded over. So what I like to do is I'll go ahead and put in some binding clips on here for the side I'm coming down so it's held in place. And then I'll go in and fold this one down and then tuck that under so it's a 45-degree angle. And then I can put a binding clip on it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to sew just across my 45-degree angle so that that's set up good, well. And then I'm going to go back as probably 1 stitch and pivot and head down the side. Okay, take that off kind of at the last minute so I can hold it. Now I'm a little bit past, like I said, and I'm going to go back a stitch, and then I'm ready to go down this side. Whoops. Didn't have my presser foot down. And I'm ready to start working down this side. So that gives me a nice looking corner when I do it that way. And then you do want to go back and hand stitch those corners down. But you can see, let me stitch just a little farther so you can see it better. You can see, and it's a little hard because it's black, but the overlap is on this side, and on the back it's on this side. So you just go in and stitch this down, poke through and stitch that down, and then tie a knot, weave through the fabric and clip it off. And you just work your way all the way around. When you get to the final corner, you'll be using the tail end and trim off the selvage again, or where you may be in the middle of a strip, and you'll lift this binding clip and tuck this under. Whoops, there at the 1/8 inch, and then lay this back down and fold this over and put a clip on it and go ahead and stitch it. So that's how you do the final one. Anyway, it's a neat method. It's 100% machine sewn, and it's fun to do, and it's fast and secure. So have fun with that. I have had to practice more than once in order to get my skills honed the way I like them. So just keep at it. Thanks a bunch.